Howdy, and welcome to episode 29 of T-Shirts and Shawls. I'm Karen, and today is Friday, May 26th, 2017. And this is actually a special bonus episode of the podcast. Today is the 1-year Podiversary, so 1 year from the first day that I launched the podcast. So I'm celebrating with this special episode, as well as a giveaway that has been going on since last week. So if you want details for the giveaway, you can watch episode 28, last week's episode, and or go to the podcast group on Ravelry, where you will find the entry thread for the giveaway. And basically how it works is I am choosing one winner per day, so there are lots of prizes to be won, and quite a few people have already won prizes so far. And the giveaway runs through May 31st. I will be doing the final giveaway sometime probably in the late afternoon of May 31st, 2017. So if you are watching this episode before that date, make sure that you enter the giveaway if you have not done so already. So part of the giveaway is to either share a memory or something you learned from a previous episode, or to ask a question that you would like me to answer on a future podcast episode. And I got a bunch of really great questions, and so I thought that I would actually just have this episode be a Q&A episode. So we're not going to have the regular segments of what I'm knitting and spinning and working on. We're just going to answer your questions. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. Although before we get started, I just want to say I have been sick this week, and although I am better, I am still not 100%. So I apologize if my voice sounds a little weird. My energy level is definitely not quite up to normal. But I've got some water and some tea beside me, and that should help me be able to record this special episode. The first question comes from Hunters99, who asks, where does most of your inspiration come from when designing your new designs? So that's a really big question, especially because I get inspiration from many places. So I decided to pick 4 of my top ways to get inspiration. So the first one is that I own a lot of stitch dictionaries. So what a stitch dictionary is a book that has a compilation of a bunch of different stitch patterns. So you can look up, like, there are ones that are specifically like cable stitch dictionaries, or ones that specifically deal with like mosaic knitting or something like that. And that's where I can kind of see, because usually there are swatches that you've got pictures of the swatches in the book, so I can kind of see what they look like. So I spend a lot of time flipping through those stitch dictionaries, and sometimes there is a stitch that catches my eye that I think, oh, I really want to do something, around that stitch. Sometimes I have kind of a vision in my head of what I want, and I look through stitch dictionaries to see if there's something that is somewhat similar that I could then kind of use as a basis and modify. So that is one method of inspiration, and a lot of designers also have libraries full of stitch dictionaries. So 2 stitches in particular that caught my eye that I knew I wanted to use, and I actually have the examples so I can show you for each one. So this is my Gringolet cowl, and when I was looking through a stitch dictionary and found this this shape here, I thought, wow, that really looks like a horseshoe. And when I thought horseshoe, because everything is technically inspired by medieval literature, so I think horseshoe, horse, and then I think Gringolet, who was Gawain's horse. And that name was used across several different stories, so it's really interesting that Gawain's horse has a name, and also that name comes across in several stories. And so when I saw that stitch pattern, I knew that I wanted to use that in creating something that was inspired by Gringolet. And so that was the inspiration behind this particular cowl. And then the other specific stitch that really caught my eye, and this one in the stitch dictionary, it looked like that. But I thought, you know, if you turn this around, this looks like shields. So if you can kind of see the outline here, I think it looks like a shield. And again, thought of medieval literature and the story of Brunhild. So this is my Brunhild cowl. She is a maiden who was locked in a tower, surrounded by flaming shields, and the hero had to basically get through that ring of shields in order to rescue her. So I thought, ring of shields, that would be perfect for a cowl that looks like a ring of shields. And so that was the inspiration for this pattern, Brunhild. And I mean, you can go to my designer page and find all of these, all of the patterns, but I will also link to these in the show notes. So sometimes it is a specific stitch that leads me to a design. Sometimes it is the yarn. So I might have a particular yarn that I know that the quality of the yarn would be really good for this or that, and I want to do something that will kind of honor the yarn. And one of the things, I don't use a lot of variegated yarn, but because sometimes it's difficult to find a pattern that it really works well with, that the colors don't pool too much, and so I was thinking about variegated yarn, and one of the ways to kind of help out breaking up pooling and to kind of get the colors to shift around is to use slipped stitches. So this was a moment where I did go to the stitch dictionaries and I looked at the sections of different slip stitches, and I found a couple of options that I liked. I made swatches with some variegated yarn and made a few, you know, changes and modifications, and then I finally came up with the idea for this cowl. So this is my Arcita cowl, and I have a matching hat pattern. That's the Palamon hat. Palamon and Arcita are characters in one of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So this is Arcita. It uses a variegated yarn and two different slip stitch patterns. So the top and bottom are the same, and then the middle one has kind of a cabled slip stitch pattern. And that allows the colors to really be broken up and to kind of make use of the variegated yarn. This looks good in semi-solids too, but it definitely is a good stitch pattern for variegated yarn. So in this case, I was inspired by the yarn, specifically the colors. So and that is another example. Sometimes, and less often these days, but there are basically what are calls for designs from third parties, so especially magazines, and usually when they do that, they have a specific theme and a mood board, and you know, you're supposed to kind of base your design off the theme and the mood board. And I've decided, early on I did submit things to third parties, not very many, but a few things. But I decided that I ultimately preferred to self-publish my designs because I wanted to have complete control over my design. Not just the rights of my design, but also making sure that the names that I used were what I wanted to use, the yarns that I used were what I wanted to use. And so I have not submitted anything to third parties lately. But I do still look at the calls for submissions because sometimes the themes and the mood boards can be inspirational. But anyway, there was one, and this was, I guess, about 2 years ago. There was one call for submissions for a magazine that asked for big cables. And I realized after, I did not, my design was not accepted. I self-published this. And I realized after I got that issue of the magazine and saw what they meant by big cables that my interpretation was completely not what they were looking for. So my big cables, not so big, but this is my Wife of Bath cowl. So basically I created a big cable by making a very elongated cable and I decided there needed to be something in the middle, and I did this eyelet pattern in the middle. So it's a really long cable. It's a pretty wide cable. I think it's a 8-stitch cable. I mean, pretty wide, not really, but compared to what I had been doing. And then I also, to kind of go with the big theme, I had some kind of chunky big buttons that went with it. So it's knit flat and then fastened by the buttons. And so this one was inspired by that call for designs. And again, not what they were looking for, but I'm happy with how it turned out. I think if I had done, this is in a fingering weight yarn, I think maybe if I had done this same idea in like a much bulkier yarn, maybe it would have been a little more. But anyway, this is something that I was inspired by for that call for designs. And then the last inspiration that I'm going to talk about is inspired directly by the story. So all the names that I give to the patterns are taken from medieval literature, and sometimes I design the item and then come up with a name, and then sometimes I have the name before I even sit down with the design, and so the design really is based upon the name. So with the new book that I'm working on now, the Parliament of Cowls, based upon Chaucer's Parliament of Fowls, I knew from the beginning, these are the birds that I'm going to be representing with the cowls, and so how am I going to have the stitch patterns kind of fit with that characteristics of the bird. So one of the birds is the goose, and the goose is actually called a fool by one of the other birds. And so that got me started thinking, fool, jester, and you think about the costume that a jester wears, kind of a collar with kind of, points with ruffles. And so that is the idea that I used for the goose cowl. So this is one, and it actually shows up better if you actually wear it. This is one that actually has these little ruffles that sits around the neck. And kind of goes with that idea. I don't think that anyone looks like a fool for wearing this, but that is kind of my thought process as I was going through and designing this particular cowl. So that was the inspiration for that one. And there are other things that I get inspired by, but those are kind of the main categories of things. So thank you very much for that question. The next question comes from Craft Mouse, and this is a really, really good question. It made me think for quite a long time. If you had to choose only 3 of your patterns that you could knit for the rest of your life, which would you choose? And she did let me include the Parliament of Cowls. So which 3 of my patterns, if they were the only 3 I could knit for the rest of my life, would I choose? Whew. So there was one pattern that jumped into mind instantly. And that is actually the shawl that I'm wearing right now. I have knit this twice, so I also have the original version. Make sure I get the right side. So I also have the original version. This is my Blanchifleur shawl, and the reason that I picked it is because it has a couple of different stitch patterns in it. So it has the starting stitch pattern, and then it moves on to this next stitch pattern, actually this one, which has these little faux noops right here, and then it goes to this pattern, and then there is a knitted on border. So the knitted on border works that you cast on these stitches and you knit going this way, and as you go back to the body each time, you do a knit 2 together to connect them. So in the end, you only end up having to bind off that many stitches rather than the entire edge. I really like doing the knitted on border, but I picked this because it has a couple of different stitch patterns, because it has the knitted on border that you can choose to do a different color or the same color. So I think it would be fun to, if I have to knit this over and over again each time, to play with different color combinations. So you can see I still kept the gray border, but I changed the body, and so it has quite a different look. I like with the faux noopes, I could choose to do beads instead of those. So I could, again, kind of give the shawl a different look. And so that is one reason I think this would be one of the 3 patterns I would pick, because I could change it up each time and make it a little bit different. So then the next one that I decided on, I thought, okay, I've got a shawl. I would like to kind of get a variety of things. So maybe I'll do one of my hat patterns. Okay, so which hat pattern would I pick? And I decided finally on my Chaucer hat. And there are 2 reasons for that. I guess 3 reasons. One, I really love doing cables, so I wanted to make sure there was something with cables in this set of 3. And the Chaucer hat has 2 different cables. By the way, if you hear anything in the background, my son is not at preschool, so he is playing in the background. So this has 2 different cable patterns. So there's that one bigger cable and then the narrower cable. And I have this hat in 3 different sizes. So kind of a men's, women's, and child size. So I would be able to, especially if I needed to do a gift or something, I would have some options. So I would be able to still do some cables and have options for sizes. So I could play around with that. So that is the second one that I would pick. I had a really hard time coming up with the third one. I thought, again, I want to do something that's different. So not a shawl, not a hat. So I've got a lot of cowl patterns, so I should pick one of those. And I stared at my designer page. I looked at the upcoming ones for Parliament of Cowls, and I finally decided on one from the Parliament of Cowls. So this is the Turtle Dove Cowl. So this is a long cowl, so a long, tall cowl. So when you put it on, it bunches up around your neck, basically. And the reason I picked this is partially the reason I picked the shawl, because it does have different colors. And so I think you could really make it different each time by picking different colored options. One of the test knitters said that he thought it would be really neat to use mini skeins and to kind of have, one main color, but then do mini skeins and then have, the stripes be different. I think that would be really fantastic. And I really hope to see people doing that. It does have the kind of subtle little heart pattern on there. But I think this would, again, be something that would allow me to change it up each time that I do it. I guess I was mostly looking for variety and options in these patterns, because if these are the only 3 I'm going to be able to knit for the rest of my life, I don't want to get bored. I definitely want variety. And so that's what I ultimately decided on. The next question comes from Cats and Yarns 1, who asks, when you are designing, do you start knitting and see where your imagination takes you, or do you have it all planned out first? So I am definitely a planner. I don't stick to a plan so strongly that I don't deviate from it. But I like to kind of know where I'm going with something, and that's not just for designs. It's for most everything that I do. So I do definitely start out with a plan. I usually have written out a bare bones pattern. If it has a chart, which all my patterns have charts, I generally create a chart either by hand on graph paper or on the computer with my charting software that I use. So I have a plan. I have an idea. And then I sit down and start knitting the sample. And while I'm knitting the sample, I am completely open to that plan changing. As I see things on the needles, sometimes I realize that what seemed to work on paper didn't work so well on the needles, whether it be something that just mathematically seemed to work, but then when I got it on the needles, didn't. Or I decide that, it doesn't quite look the way I thought it would look, and so I want to change it. So there are many different reasons for why I might, make some changes on the needles. But basically, I have a paper and a pen or pencil beside me, so I can jot down notes. Not always the best at jotting down those notes. Sometimes I think, oh, I'll remember what I changed here. And in a couple of cases, that has definitely come back to be a very bad thing. So I try to keep better notes for any changes that I make. So then I make the changes kind of on the needles, and then go back, and when I write up the full pattern, then I use my bare bones pattern and then add in those changes and then flesh out everything else. I know there are people who sit down and just think, I'm going to knit a hat, and just start knitting and have something happen. I've never tried it that way because I really don't think that it will work for me. But I know that there are people who do that, and then there are people who are the exact opposite, that have the exact plan sketched out and they don't deviate from it. In fact, some of the most prolific designers don't actually do much of the knitting themselves. They will knit swatches and then create the designs and have a fully written up pattern, and then send it off to a sample knitter who actually knits a sample. Because almost every design that I've done has some type of change on the needles, I feel like for me, knitting the item is part of that process. So that's why I do all my sample knitting myself. But there are definitely different ways that people work. So I guess I'm kind of in the middle. Start with a plan, but I'm okay with making some changes on the needles. The next question comes from Loyola Girl, who asks, what has been your most challenging project and why? And this is another one where I spent quite a bit of time going through all my projects on Ravelry, which, by the way, if you do not keep a list of your projects on Ravelry, I really encourage you to do that. It is really fantastic to be able to just scroll through all the things that I've done and be able to remind myself of my projects. It was helpful in answering these questions. So if you don't do that, I definitely encourage you to do it. So I finally, I thought, okay, so my most challenging could have been my first sock. I learned a lot about knitting socks. It could have been the first cardigan that I made, which was made for my mom, because it involved seaming, and I learned, that was quite a challenge. Or, my first this or my first that. But I finally decided to narrow it down to two. I know the question was the most, but I narrowed it down to two because I couldn't pick between these two. So one I still have, and the other one was a gift. So I will show you pictures of the one with the gift. So the one that in many ways was most challenging was an Afghan that I made for my mother-in-law. And my mother-in-law, I mentioned before, is a very knit-worthy person. So she is also a quilter, and so I know that she understands handmade things. And a long time back, Knit Picks had a kit for an Afghan that looked like a quilt. So I wish I had a better picture of this. But this is the knitted quilt, and actually, there we go. So it's kind of a lap Afghan that looks like a quilt. And each of those blocks were knit separately, so as separate blocks, and they had different, I guess they were knit in different pieces. So here's an in progress picture. Each block had basically, you knit each color element and lots of shaping and connecting them. And then after, you finish each block, then I had to seam them all together. And so all of that was definitely a challenge. But the most challenging part, let's load this picture, this is one block. There's the back of one block. Do you see how many ends there were to weave in? Can you imagine? All those colors. So all those ends. Let me show you that again. One block. And there were 12 blocks in this. So I definitely got a lot of practice weaving in ends with that project. Oh my goodness. Definitely a crazy project, but like I said, my mother-in-law, so knit worthy. So I did not mind mostly did not mind doing it for her. I know she loved it. And when I gave it to her, it was actually a weekend that I was visiting that her quilt guild was meeting and doing a show and tell. And so she actually brought that as a show and tell for her quilt guild. She was so proud of it that I made it for her. So like I said, she's very knit worthy. So that is one of my most challenging projects. My other most challenging project is this garment, this top. So I'm going to show you some up close details. So it is a basically a tank top type of thing. Oh, it has this little like ruffly edge on the bottom. And the reason this was so challenging is the pattern was very well written, but mostly for purposes of sizing, each of these sections had its own chart. So for each row, I had to refer to, I think there were 6 or 7 different charts. The back is the same as the front. And so I had to, and this was several years ago that I made this, so I had to basically shuffle around pieces of paper and keep track of where I was on each chart, because each chart had different numbers of rows, and so it was, really hard to keep track of. So it was definitely a big challenge. I think now that I use Knit Companion, I could, put those charts together electronically, and that would be easier. But this was a very challenging project that I was very happy to complete. I really pushed myself to complete this. Unfortunately, I started it before I was pregnant and finished it. I think it was 3 or 4 months pregnant when I finished it. And I have never gotten back to my pre-pregnancy weight. This top is too small for me. I can't wear it. I've never worn it because I was pregnant when I finished with it and it didn't fit then, and it has never fit since. So it has been sitting in my closet. But it was a really good knitting challenge, but unfortunately one that I don't get to use. The next question is from A Simple Motif, who asks, does your knitting change in the summer? Do you switch projects or fiber? The short answer is no. I knit just as much in the summer as I do in the winter. So I don't think anything really changes. I don't really pay much attention to the type of project that I'm knitting, just whatever I feel like knitting at the time. Since mostly I am doing accessories and smaller projects, that probably is the reason. I think if I did a lot of larger projects, a lot of Afghans or even sweaters, maybe I wouldn't do those as much in the summer, because kind of the weight of that in the lap might be a bit hot. So I think just because I'm doing smaller projects usually, don't really make that big of a change. As far as the yarn content, I knit with wool year round. I am definitely, that is the wool or wool blends. That's the fiber that I love. I know some people switch to cotton or linen in the summer, but I can't do that. Cotton I do not like knitting with. It hurts my hands. I don't find it to be enjoyable. And I actually have not tried knitting with linen, 100% linen. It just always feels, I know that it's something that softens up as you wash it, but that doesn't mean it's any more enjoyable to knit with it. And so I have knit with cotton for sure in the past. And each time I wonder, what am I doing to myself? I'm not enjoying this knitting. I have noticed that there are times where the weather does affect the knitting a little bit. A few years back, we went on a trip to Hawaii, and I brought a sock with me. I brought a pair of socks to knit, and I did not do very much knitting at all on that trip, because my hands did start to feel a little bit sweaty with just having the wool wrapped around my finger to tension it. So yeah, I guess in that case, I really didn't do much knitting. But we spend a lot of time outside, and so definitely knitting outside in the hot weather is not so much fun. But in the summer, I spend a lot of time inside. Since we're in Texas, summers are not super pleasant to be outside since it is so hot. So I spend a lot of time inside in the air conditioning. So in that case, because of the air conditioning, it usually doesn't, the heat doesn't affect my knitting quite as much. And I hear Luke in the background. Don't know if you can hear him, but he's making a lot more noise now. We'll see. Hopefully it doesn't disturb you guys too much. So short answer, no, knitting really doesn't change that much. But especially if I'm doing any outdoors activities, I'm probably not knitting in the heat. The next question comes from Ash Salt, who says that she loved the early episode where I talked about learning to knit and learning about the importance of gauge and discovering different yarns. It would be great to hear kind of the same thing about how you got into dyeing. First projects or experiments, figuring out what you like to dye and don't like to dye, etc. Okay, so dyeing is one of those things that I originally told myself I will never be interested in dyeing. One of the things I have learned is to never say never. I also had said that about spinning. I will never be interested in spinning. And obviously that is untrue. But I really didn't think that I would really want to dye yarn. And so I love indie dyed yarn. I have loved indie dyed yarn for a number of years. And I was perfectly happy with just getting yarn from other people who were doing the dyeing. And several of my friends, I mentioned in the Mafia especially, but several friends in this area were indie dyers, and so I felt I was good. I was happy designing patterns, and if I wanted to use their yarn, then I could do that. So that was I'm never going to be interested in it. And I have a friend who dyed fiber, and she took a break from dyeing fiber for a while. She had a young child, and the way she was dyeing fiber, there were lots of hot pans of water coming out of the oven, and she decided while he was really young to take a break. And then as he got older, she was thinking that she would, and by the way, I'm scrolling on Instagram right now in case I keep looking down, because I actually have some pictures from way early on Instagram that I want to show you guys. So she was taking a break from dyeing fiber, and then she finally decided that maybe it was time to start dyeing again, and she was going to add yarn as well as fiber. And so she had gotten some yarn, some samples of different bases from a supplier, and we talked a lot about her yarn bases that she was picking, because we thought we would actually do some collaboration, and I would design patterns and she would dye the yarn, and we would pick yarn that specifically went with the patterns that I was designing. Okay, I think I'm back to the beginning on Instagram. So that was our original plan. And then she decided that she was, there it is. Then she decided that she was not going to dye the yarn after all. That she's not going to start back up with her yarn and fiber business. So she gave me the bag of undyed yarn to use as yarn for swatching. So swatching for my designs. And I stared at that bag of undyed yarn, and instead of thinking about all the things that I could swatch with it, I thought, that yarn just needs color. It needs to be dyed. And suddenly my mind started thinking about adding color to the yarn, and that's all I could think about. And so I actually ordered a sample dye kit from a supplier, a dye supplier that I actually still use as one of my dye suppliers. So I got a little sample dye kit, and I thought about the types of dyeing I wanted to do. And there, apparently Luke is playing some emergency services. There's a siren that he's pretending to be. Hang on just a second. Okay, hopefully the emergency is over. So I got the sample dyes, and I started to think about what kind of dyeing I wanted to do. And I realized that most of the yarns that I buy and use are semi-solids and tonals rather than the variegated colors, because I love doing lace and cables, and that just works better. And so I decided that I wanted to dye semi-solids and tonals. So I did research for, the different dye methods that produce that, and mostly I was interested in immersion dyeing, which basically means getting a big pot of water, putting in, since I'm using acid dyes, putting in the dye, the acid, and then adding heat. And there are lots of ways that you can go about doing that, but I decided, especially since I also had a small child, that using crock pots was the best method for me for that, because that's something I could kind of push back away from the counter. I wouldn't have an open flame going because we have a gas stovetop, so I could have gotten, a big stock pot and put it on the stovetop, but that would be an open flame going for several hours. Did not want to do that with Luke. So the crock pots seem to be my method. And once you use a container for dyeing, you cannot use that for food consumption again. So the crock pot that I used had to be one that was solely for dyeing and could never be used for food. So I went out and just bought a small crock pot. And I started my first experiments. And this is actually a very blurry picture of the first yarn that I dyed. So you can kind of maybe see the black crock pot, and there is a purple dye that I put in there. And that is the first yarn that I dyed. And apparently I also did a blue as the second one. And so this is the results of my first dyeing. I have a lot to learn, between that and where I am now. But that was the results of my first 2 skeins that I ever dyed. And again, I was using those bases that my friend had given me, and there were 10 skeins of yarn, and it looks like here are 4, 5, 6 of them. So those are the purple and the blue that I started with, and then here are some of the other colors that I experimented with. So my first 6 skeins that I dyed, and then I realized I really like doing this, and I ordered some yarn. So that is my first supply of undyed yarn that I ordered, and then I just started going. And here's another example. So I'm learning a bit more, experimenting with different colors. So there's some more that I did there, and then here's the next set of, the picture's not loading, the next set of yarn that I dyed. So there it is. And as I'm doing this, I'm realizing, what? I am getting, so here's this bucket full of yarn that I'm dyeing. I am dyeing yarn way faster than I will ever be able to knit it. And I think it really helped that I knew several indie dyers and other people. And I just decided, what? I can do this. I can dye the yarn and sell it. And so originally I was going to dye the yarn and just, then use it for swatching and knit up those samples. But it went really quickly from, I really just instantly fell in love with dyeing yarn and experimenting and coming up with different colors and mixing. And I realized that it was going to get out of hand really quickly, and you can see all the yarn behind me. way more than I could ever use myself, especially because I wanted to continue buying other yarns. I didn't want to just knit stuff that I dyed. So that's where the idea for Roundtable Yarns came from. And the idea moved pretty quickly. I contacted a graphic designer, got a logo set up, and then, so 2015 at DFW Fiberfest, I shared a booth with that same friend who gave me the bag of undyed yarn to start with, and that was the debut of Roundtable Yarns. So I went within probably about 6 months from I'm never going to be interested in dyeing yarn to Roundtable Yarns being born. So that moved pretty quickly. And I've learned a lot since then, different dyeing methods. I added the self-striping, obviously. Learned a lot about kind of the process, that doing one skein at a time in the small crock pot was not going to cut it. So I've expanded, what I use as far as my my equipment, and but I'm still, still loving mixing the colors, trying to come up with different ideas, see what comes out, what happens when I dye yarn, fluorescent lemon, fluorescent yellow, and then I put another color on top of it. What does that change into? So all of that just is really fun, and I'm definitely enjoying it. So kind of crazy that I guess it's all the fault of that one friend and that bag of undyed yarn. If it weren't for that, then I might not be where I am now. So thank you, Taya, for giving me that undyed yarn. It was really, really an awesome start and inspiration and blank canvas to work from. The next question is from Care Bear, who has kind of a series of questions. So, have you ever taken a class to learn how to knit a special technique, or just something you wanted to learn, or are you self-taught by videos and books? Do you favor one type of learning to knit over the other? So basically, what type of learner are you? And she says that she guesses, because of my love of literature and reading, that I probably learned through books. And yes, mostly I am a self-taught knitter. From the beginning, I mentioned that I used that Stitch and Bitch book to teach myself how to knit, although I did use some of the videos from the knittinghelp.com website. That was my first experience with knitting videos, and so through the book and through those videos is how I taught myself the basics of knitting. And I do ultimately prefer to look at something in a book or watch a video and teach myself. I definitely am kind of an autodidact. I learn best when I am kind of doing it myself. But I also really enjoy taking knitting classes. And some of it is for sure for learning the technique. But also I really like sometimes I really like that classroom atmosphere and learning with a group of other people. So, especially while I was still up in Indiana in Lafayette, the knitting shop there, I took quite a few classes, and a lot of it was the teacher was really, she was really fantastic, but I also, I just enjoyed being able to spend time with other people that were taking the classes. So I think if I had to choose one for my actual learning, it would be the self-taught types of things, but I definitely value the experience of being in a room with other people who are also learning. I really enjoy that experience, kind of the whole of it. So while I may not, and I'm not saying that I don't need the class, while the class itself, I probably could have figured out the material on my own, I really enjoy the environment of being in a class. And and maybe that comes from being kind of almost a lifelong student, going through graduate school, doing my own teaching and kind of being in that classroom environment. I really enjoy that. So if there are classes that have topics that I'm even kind of remotely interested in, I will take a class just to have that classroom environment. But if it's something that I'm trying to learn because I want to make this specific pattern, then I will look up. Mostly now I look up videos, but I do still have books that I also refer to and look that up. If in the moment I need to learn something. So a little bit of both, and I think classes are super helpful and have that added community, and I really love that. The next question is from Tim Stevens 4, and Tim asks, what has been your most challenging and or rewarding knitted project? And most challenging, I did answer that one, but the most rewarding. And in many ways, most rewarding could also be seen as most challenging, because obviously when you finish a really challenging project, that is something that is very rewarding. But I thought about, which project, so, how do you define rewarding? Which project has been the project that has kind of made me the happiest to complete? And a lot of those have been gifts. But I was looking at my project pages on Ravelry, and I saw the picture of this project, and I'll show you the picture in a minute. And just the grin and smile on my face just made me feel like this is the project that I found to be the most rewarding, the one that I was the happiest about. And that is my first sweater for me. So this is my Quidditch sweater, so from Harry Potter. And it is a sweater that was done in pieces, so the front and the back, and then the sleeves were knit flat, and then everything was seamed, and then the collar was picked up. So I don't knit a lot of garments. I definitely don't do a lot of seaming. And then this is also all ribbing. So this was a project that was definitely something that took quite a bit of work. I actually knit on some of it. I believe it was the 5th book release. Maybe, I don't remember. I think it was the 5th book. The midnight release party of the 5th book is when I was working on this, so I have memories of that, sitting down in the bookstore and working on this. And the nice thing is, since it's a ribbed sweater, it still fits me, even though I have gained some weight since I knit it, but it does still fit me and I can still wear it. So this is a project that I feel like was most rewarding. And if you take a look at the picture, look at that grin on my face. I think I was pretty pleased with finishing this project. So there probably have been, obviously there were projects that were more difficult, more challenging, but this project is one that's kind of one of my favorite projects, and that obviously with that grin, really happy with completing. Next question is from PTM Smith, who asks, would you ever be interested in teaching a class on how to dye yarn? So the fast, easy answer is yes. The longer answer is, but probably not anytime soon, and or I have no specific plans to do that. And the reasoning behind that is a lot to do with logistics. Because with the acid dyes, the dyes I use, it involves heat and usually water. It can be a difficult challenge to do that at, say, like a fiber festival. It's my understanding, like at DFW Fiber Festival, the reason there have not been dyeing classes is because the convention center is really not interested in having a whole bunch of heating elements going at one time, as well as the potential mess that the dyeing could make. I could be wrong on that, but that's something that I've heard. So logistically, it does take quite a bit to put it together. There were some dyeing classes at Plyaway done in the hotel kind of convention area. So I know it can be done, but it's something that you would have to find the right place to do it. So the right venue. So that's one thing, and I also so I'm not sure. And then someplace at like DFW Fiberfest, the reason I haven't ever submitted any classes is because I'm in the vendor hall, and if I would be teaching classes, I wouldn't be at my booth, and I really like being at my booth and being able to meet those of you who come by. So it's kind of, I have to choose, do I want to be a vendor or a teacher? So those types of things. So potentially, if the right venue came along that I'm not also a vendor at, that could be something that I do. But it definitely is something. And then also, you've got all the heating elements. So say we use crock pots, or a hot plate with a pan or a pot. Depending on how many students are in the class, I would want each student to have their own, let's say crock pot, their own crock pot, so that way you can do the dyeing. I think it's much more helpful if you are actually doing it rather than if I just give you all the information and then just demonstrate it. And so that would be a lot of heating elements going. So everyone would either need to bring their own crock pot, or I would have to provide them, which would be obviously materials fees. And then again, like I mentioned earlier, once you use a container for dyeing, it cannot be used for anything else ever again, and not for food. So especially if people provided their own crock pots, that's something that they would have to know that if they wanted to continue doing some dyeing, then they have that, but they could never use that again. So like I said, it's a lot to do with logistics. So I'm not going to say never, because I think it would be fun, but it definitely would require a lot of setup. That being said, I have my ideas and plans for what I want to happen to Roundtable Yarns in the future. And one of those things is that currently I'm doing all the dyeing in my house, in my kitchen. I really, really would love to have a studio space, a space where I can actually set up a dye studio and to go there and do the dyeing and to get my kitchen back, basically. So that's one of my goals, but I have to make sure that financially the company is making enough money to be able to cover rent for a studio space. And right now, I'm just not at that point. I'll just be completely honest. Not making enough money to cover a studio space. But that is my goal. I want to be able to do that. And I think that if I were to have a studio space, then that might be something where I could offer, that would give me space to offer some classes. So that is something that I will keep in mind when I get a studio space, that potentially I could do something there. The other thing that I want to mention here is that it's not an in-person dyeing class, but Felicia Lowe of Sweet Georgia Yarns is actually working on setting up an online school for dyeing. Doing online classes. And if you've not ever listened to Felicia Lowe on a podcast or anything, she is such a sweet, nice, helpful person. I've never met her, but I have listened to her podcast and watched some classes that she did with Craftsy. She actually has a spinning class that I found really helpful. So she is currently working on getting an online school for dyeing set up. And she has a Patreon page set up right now that she is using to help support this whole setup and to get this off the ground. And I just became a patron last week. So I'm basically, how Patreon works is you agree to, donate a monthly dollar amount to the project. And then the person knows that they have that money each month coming in for, to be able to maintain the project. And the dollar amounts can be small. I mean, you can donate $1 a month. So she has levels of 1, 3, 5, 15, and 25. I think those are the levels. And at each level you get perks. So at the level I am, which is the $5 level, I get, updates on what's going on with the dye studio. And then apparently there's going to be a place where we can go to have a conversation to give her feedback for the kinds of classes we'd like to see. At higher levels, you get first access to classes and whatnot. So if that is something you are interested in, I am going to include a link to her Patreon page in the show notes, so that way you can go take a look at that. I think she is the perfect person to do this, and I'm really excited to see what she comes up with, and very happy to support that. So if you are interested in that at all, I hope you will go over there and consider even supporting her at the $1 a month level. I know that would be really helpful. And by the way, just as a kind of tying all that together, I have thought about starting a Patreon page to do things like be able to potentially have money to pay rent for a dye studio for myself, for Roundtable Yarns. So if that is something you would potentially be interested in, helping do a monthly kind of support to help me create that dye studio so I could do things like expand Roundtable Yarns a little bit, and potentially offer some in-person dye classes, let me know. I mean, it's something that it's quite a commitment to do that, from month to month. Sorry again, Luke's making a lot of noise. So I haven't started that yet because I need to make sure that I'm ready to commit to that, for month to month, what that would be, and what the perks would be with the different levels. So that's kind of been in the back of my mind, but that is something that I'm potentially considering as well. So, like I said, I've got lots of ideas for what I want to do with Roundtable Yarns in the future. I know your question started off with, would I ever be interested in teaching a dyeing class, but that's kind of a lot of thoughts that I've been having that might potentially lead toward eventually doing that. So I think that is all of the questions so far. I went back and reread all of the comments, and I'm pretty sure I've gotten all the questions. If I missed your question, or if you post a question after this particular episode airs, then I will get to it on a future podcast episode. I really, really appreciate all the questions, and especially all the comments. It was really nice to read what you guys said. I really appreciate that you spend the time to watch the podcast, but also that you took the time to make some comments. I was really struck by some things. Several of you mentioned how helpful it was to see how I store yarn. That was way back on an early episode. You said it gave you some ideas, so I'm really happy to hear that helped. Several of you mentioned the cats. So sharing those stories. I wasn't sure when I was recording those episodes about the cats how much I should share. So knowing that, not that you guys enjoyed it, but that you, I guess that you appreciated that I shared those stories, makes me, I guess that I appreciate that you listened to the stories. Many of you said you really liked when I was talking about the fiber community and kind of raising each other up. That is something that is really important to me, so I'm glad that it struck a note in with several of you guys. And just really thank you so very much the past year, whether you have watched from the very beginning or if you are a newer viewer. I appreciate so much that you guys are watching. And I am planning to continue this journey, and and see where it leads me for the next year in the podcast and in the dyeing and designing. So I will be back next week with a regular episode. You can see what I've been working on since last week. And again, the giveaway is still going on through the last drawing on May 31st. So if you have not entered yet, it is not too late, as long as it's before May 31st. It's not too late to enter. So please feel free to go to the Ravelry group and do that. And I will go edit this episode, upload it, and then also do today's giveaway. So I will see you guys on the Ravelry group and online on the video next week. Thanks, and happy knitting. Can you tell I'm sick? Have I been rambling a lot in this episode? I hope things made sense. Yeah. Anyway, goodbye.